Thanks very much, Alan, for those very nice words. It's not entirely true to say the slow lane readers were slow. They did respond, but I would say more in sadness than anger, which I think is appropriate, because I think behind anger is often sadness. And then many people wrote saying they regretted it. But anyway, I had a great time doing that for many years. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between the selfie and the self-portrait. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on either of these things. I'm certainly not an expert on the selfie, because I've never taken one. I wouldn't know how to take one. But it seems that we live in the time of the selfie. It could even be the defining characteristic of our era, this habit of taking pictures of oneself with a mobile phone, often attached to that egregious accessory, the selfie stick. And I do wonder what future archaeologists might make of these peculiar, apparently useless telescopic batons, which presumably will be found in many sites. So does this mean we also live in a great time of self-portraiture? I'm not sure about that. I'm afraid I have no visual aids, but fortunately, two of Julian's slides were very relevant to my talk, the Dürer self-portrait and the Van Gogh self-portrait. And I'm going to be referring to an exhibition which I expect none of you have seen, so this will be extremely annoying, but maybe some of you have seen it. It's called Reflections on the Self at Christie's Mayfair. Has anyone seen this exhibition? I thoroughly recommend it. It's still on for a while, which made me, which also focused my thoughts about self-portraiture in many ways. So anyway, what's wrong with the selfie, for a start? The veteran fashion collector Eyres put it bluntly, it's taking narcissism to a ridiculous degree. But that might give rise to another question: what's wrong with narcissism? Derrida pointed out that we're all narcissistic to some degree. We're unavoidably caught up with ourselves, fascinated with ourselves. But perhaps in this case, the narcissism of the selfie could be defined as being caught up with ourselves and staring at ourselves without seeing ourselves at all. Now, I'm tempted to say there's something stupid about selfies, but I think that would perhaps be unwise. So let me put it slightly differently. There seems to be a kind of smugness about the selfie, based perhaps on false assumptions. The selfie is a bit like Mr. Pooter in Diary of a Nobody, who assumes that he is far more important and interesting than he really is. The selfie seems to be perhaps no more or less than a banal assertion of identity or existence. Its motto could be, "I'm still here." And some of you might remember that was the refrain of Rory Bremner's brilliant impersonation of the ineffectual former British Prime Minister John Major. And the response to that was, yeah, I'm still here, but so what? So this is one assumption of the selfie, that I'm actually more important than I really am. Here's another assumption, perhaps slightly more interesting, might be this. The selfie says, here I am, and you and I know who I am. And this is where I think the selfie assumes too much familiarity with the self. I've suggested in my title that the selfie is unself-knowing, but what is the self anyway? This is a question that John Burnside raised yesterday. What does it mean for an artist to be self-knowing? Is there even a self, let alone a fixed, unchangeable self, to know? Not according to David Hume. I'm sure you're all very familiar with what he said about the self, who said that the deeper you looked into yourself, the more elusive the self became. This is from Hume. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression constant and invariable. I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. Our eyes cannot turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. So that's quite a sort of cold blast on the idea of the self. It's also, I think, casting doubt on the value of introspection. But artists have a way out of that. They can describe what they see, the surface, the flesh. That's certainly what Lucian Freud does. And I'm sorry I can't show you the pictures, but perhaps you could imagine some Lucian Freud self-portraits. There are 4 of them in this Christie's show. The Freuds seem to say to me, this is all there is, my flesh, my handsome then aging face, my broken nose, my uncanny cold blue eyes. Lucian Freud seems to me to be a Humean. He's discouraging introspection, or possibly even any idea that there is a deeper self lurking somewhere in there. In this show, there's a wonderful Frank Auerbach self-portrait. It's a drawing. This seems to me completely different. Auerbach's self-portrait is made of minimal marks. There's really not much there, no color, very little detail. But the effect is extraordinarily great from these minimal marks. And I think you have to use the word spiritual. I can't think of a better word. So Auerbach seems to me to be pointing in a very different direction from Freud. He's saying what matters about me is not this contingent flesh, it's something to do with my spirit. And certainly Julian, in his very sort of dazzling talk, gave some pointers to why that might be. Well, perhaps one of the differences between a selfie and a self-portrait is that the self-portrait takes a step back. It doesn't immediately assume that the self is familiar. In this sense, every self-portraitist is following that strange and rather terrifying dictum of Rimbaud, je est un autre. So what might that mean, je est un autre? Well, it could just first of all mean you ask for a certain degree of self-observation. Apply to yourself the same principles you would apply to any other subject. Selfies don't seem to me to require any observation, just perhaps a modicum of framing. But observing yourself is not all that easy. Observing anything is not all that easy. It's something artists are trained to do, or used to be trained to do. But when the thing you are observing, the thing in inverted commas, is yourself, the difficulties multiply. Heidegger said that for men, the path towards what is near is always the longest and therefore the most difficult. You could also say we have more illusions about ourselves than about anything else in the universe. We construct self-images which are unavoidably flattering. Well, maybe Lucian Freud is under no illusions about himself, at least physically, and that already takes some courage. So is self-portraiture about facing up to the self, or how far one can face up to oneself? Some of us can never face up to ourselves, and that's the theme of Joseph Conrad's great novel Lord Jim, about the man whose life is defined by one inexplicable moment of cowardice, which he can never face up to. Well, this is coming back to one of Julian's slides, and I'll also be talking about the Dürer in a minute, but one of the high points, I'd say, of the courageous facing up to oneself comes with the self-portraits of Vincent van Gogh. He and we, I suppose, because we're facing up to him in a sense, we're facing up to the sheer intensity of this man, his capacity for joy and suffering and compassion. And I think, and I wrote this before I'd heard Julian's talk, but I did think that his ancestor was Albrecht Dürer, in that amazing self-portrait of himself looking like Christ in the Alta Pinakothek in Munich. And I loved Julian's reading of that, actually, as a profoundly humble portrait, and that made me actually rethink it. But maybe all this intensity is a bit much. I'm thinking about now, and I'm thinking about the selfie. I mean, you can't get much more intense, can you, than Van Gogh and Dürer. And the idea that maybe in all that intense self-scrutiny is too much is perhaps the implication of a very interesting photograph in this Christie's show called Alta Pinakothek Self-Portrait, Munich 2000, by Thomas Struth. Is that the right sort of pronunciation? I was going to say Struth, which is sort of English, but I think Struth might be better. A photographer, but very interesting work, in which the artist, that is Struth, not Dürer, appears as an anonymous figure in a blue jacket with his back turned to us and his hands in his pockets, looking at the Dürer self-portrait, though with what expression we can only imagine. And Struth could be anybody. He could be a tourist, a curator, a gallery assistant. This is a self-portrait which asks a number of questions I found very interesting to contemplate, and some of them are answered later in this Christie's show. One thing is really quite radical. The artist makes no attempt to face us. He turns his back on us. So can a back or other body parts be as expressive as a face? Does the face have to be the locus of self-portraiture? There's a painting by Martin Kippenberger, Untitled, showing the artist's writhing, bloody-looking hands, which are thrust towards the viewer, maybe in accusation or in self-loathing, I'm not sure. The effect is both Shakespearean, a mixture of the murderous Macbeths and Hamlet's disillusioned view of hands as pickers and stealers, and also very modern. But in this Christie's show, it also gestures back towards a completely different, serene and guilt-free drawing of the artist's hands by Henry Moore. So I know I'm sorry to be referring so much to this show you haven't seen, but I hope perhaps some of you will see it. Can hands be as expressive as a face? There are a number of women artists in this show who reject the relatively controlled and authoritative face in favor of the unclothed and sometimes abandoned-looking body. One of the most beautiful and haunting images for me was a portrait by Francesca Woodman, the photographer who committed suicide at a very young age, very tragically, in a sort of semi-fetal position, half encircling an eel in a bucket, as elusive, enigmatic, and economical as a hexagram from the I Ching, but much more erotic. There's a huge self-portrait by Jenny Saville, which is disturbing in its overwhelming fleshiness, but it also, to me, suggests the kind of oceanic intrauterine state, a sort of state of being which is very, very far removed from the kind of wry, humorous, and assured self-image that you get in certain 18th century self-portraits. And there's one in the show by the Swiss-French artist Jean-Étienne Lyotard, very wry, very humorous, very in control. He seems to be saying, I really know who I am. But then, also going back to this Struth self-portrait, looking at the Dürer and a figure who's completely anonymous. So it's not just that je est un autre, but je could be all sorts of autres, plural, that is, many different others. So here's a question about the singularity of the self. Andy Warhol and Cindy Sherman make so-called self-portraits of multiple personae. Is this a more honest reflection of the multiplicity of the self than the quasi-heroic self-images of Lucian Freud or Eric or Kossoff or Auerbach? Well, another question raised by the clever Thomas Struth: how seriously should we take ourselves? He doesn't seem to take himself all that seriously. Certainly not half or a quarter as seriously as the ultra-intense Albrecht Dürer. And I'm wondering, although Julian didn't mention this, how much of a critique there might be in Struth's sort of rather enigmatic picture of himself looking at Dürer, of a whole strand of German culture which led perhaps to Romanticism, and then beyond that to Nazism even. I'm not sure, but that's something that I thought about. Well, the self-mocking self-portrait is taken to an extreme form by the Italian artist Maurizio Cattelan. I don't know whether you know some of his works. Known for his rather sort of outrageous and sort of pranksterish works. There's nothing really here except irony. In a work called We, two identical, slightly less than life-sized sort of plastic versions of Cattelan lie down in a bed which looks more like a coffin. And you can make of that what you like, but I think that's irony with nothing else. So I'm wondering whether we could make a big statement and say that we don't live in the era of the heroic self anymore, and perhaps the whole idea of the self-portrait is redundant. The postmodern self is ironic and multiple. Maybe that's where we are now, and maybe that place is not so far from the place of the selfie, though with irony added. And I don't think irony is a particular characteristic of the selfie. I may be wrong, but perhaps they're much more ironic than I realize. They don't seem to me to be ironic on the whole. But I don't really want to end on that note. And you might have noticed there's one artist, well, actually, again, who appeared in Julian's talk, who so far I haven't mentioned, quite well known for self-portraits. This is Rembrandt, who seems to me to encompass most of the tendencies I'm talking about, these apparently very modern or even postmodern tendencies, but then to go beyond them. First of all, you have the multiple self. Well, Rembrandt loves dressing up. We all know that. And how many Rembrandts are there? There are probably quite a lot. There's the sort of shaman artist in his smock with his paintbrush and palette in the great Kenwood self-portrait, the one with the two circles. Then there's a Renaissance courtier with a wide flat hat in one of the London National Gallery self-portraits. This seems to be sort of Rembrandt as somebody in the time of Titian, completely different. Then there's also Rembrandt as the good Protestant burgher with his white lace collar, another very different character. He also likes furs and jewelry. He could be an Old Testament character. And then in the recent late Rembrandt show, which perhaps some of you saw either in London or in Amsterdam, in fact, you would only have seen this in Amsterdam, so it wasn't in the London version. There's an amazing self-portrait as Zeuxis, the ancient Greek artist, who was said to have laughed himself to death when he painted an old hag in the guise of Aphrodite. And that's, again, a very different Rembrandt, as we think of him as serious, possibly quite sad, self-knowing. But this is him sort of laughing in a rather devilish way. So there are many Rembrandts. The self-mocking self. Well, Rembrandt doesn't always take himself ultra seriously. In the Christie's show, there are two beautiful prints showing the artist pulling faces. But one thing about Rembrandt is that he doesn't turn his back on us. He faces us. And he doesn't just present himself, I would say, which is perhaps a tendency of the selfie, kind of self-presentation, but he invites us into himself. And it seems to me, despite what Hume said about there being no self really down there, he seems to invite us deeper and deeper into himself through layers of defeat and resilience into some very profound human core. I think this is something to do with compassion, and I think it's also, here I would try to take a move into ethics, and I think this is sort of the ethical self-portrait. And this is in my final thoughts, I'm thinking of the great philosopher of ethics, Emmanuel Levinas, who talks about the face as being essential to ethics. And the face both makes us vulnerable and also issues a command, thou shalt not kill. And Rembrandt's self-portraits seem to me an invitation to compassion. In a way, they're an invitation to compassion towards ourselves, however defeated we might feel. But that also connects with compassion towards others. After all, je est un autre. And so in a paradoxical way, the self-portrait might be the way in which we actually understand the otherness of the other, or certainly the self-portrait as evinced by Rembrandt. And this seems to me very, very far away from anything that could be achieved by a selfie. And I still think there's something in that which perhaps could inspire artists now and beyond. So I hope that we haven't reached the end of the era of self-portraiture. I hope there's a way, this ethical way still has quite a way to go. But I don't think the way of the selfie is ever going to be that way. So those are my reflections. Very happy to take any questions.
The selfie has a lot to do with technology, and not only technology, but with communication. First, you need the technique on the mobile phone, and then you need the social networks. You need Facebook and so on, so on.
Yeah.
And it had nothing to do with art, as probably mass communication has nothing to do with art, newspapers or magazines. But it's a wonderful tool for millions and millions, probably billions now, to communicate. That's me, beside my wife or you, and I'm in Venice. Snapchat, 8 seconds. So that's all. That's a total new system. Nothing to do with Dürer or Rembrandt or Van Gogh or Cézanne. Nothing to blame about. But we have to face that letters are gone, many things are gone, and there are new tools of communication.
Right. I mean, yes, I think that's right. I don't think it has much to do with that. But I also wonder whether it really is communication. I mean, is communication just sending something like that? I mean, mightn't communication really have something to do with listening to somebody, perhaps, or even, I'm not even sure that this kind of communication is communication in any sort of profound way. I don't know what anyone thinks about that, but I don't really know that I'm not quite sure to what extent sending stuff in this sort of instant way is exactly communication.
Well, is it not communication the way a postcard was, and this is its replacement, really? People no longer send postcards from Venice, they send...
But even a postcard, you do think a little bit about the recipient, each particular recipient. And then, I mean, maybe some people, if you just put "wish you were here," that kind of postcard, maybe yes. But I mean, if you actually are thinking about the person, there's already slightly more of communication than there is in sending a... Yeah. Although I must say, I don't mean to knock this entirely, because there's somebody here who posted some beautiful photographs of Venice, because he was lucky enough to be here for a few days before I arrived, and with a rather nice Panama hat, and I won't say who it was, but I very much enjoyed that. So I'm being a bit hypocritical here.
I wonder with the motive behind the selfie. So you suggested narcissism at one point, and maybe that's an element. But you also suggested. Like I'm still here, you said, I'm still here. And I thought that was more onto the main current of the sort of motive behind selfies. I think that's a sort of like anxiety behind it, or something like that.
Yes, sort of reassurance thing. Yes.
Yeah,
I see what you mean. Yeah.
It's often not at, people often. I mean, Roger's right to say sometimes you're exalting yourself over the setting, but people take selfies of groups of themselves, or they take selfies of themselves when they're not doing anything important, and then they want to put it before other people, so that all those other people see it and say, look at him, he's there, and you can feel all those people know I'm here, so I'm pretty sure I am here, I'm pretty sure. So I thought that doesn't seem so much like, it's not so much this, certainly not narcissism in the sense of exalting yourself as this glorious thing necessarily. There's a kind of anxiety or frailty that's involved in the motive behind it, which I don't mean to say that as a vindication of it, but just I wanted to pick that out of what you said about the motives and say that I agreed with that part more than the other part.
Yes, no, I think that's a very interesting point, and I think you're definitely onto something. And I think we perhaps do live in a time when we become so insecure about our existence that if it's not constantly, reaffirmed by, I don't know whether there are statistics of what happens to people when they sort of go off Facebook, or and they might sort of feel, or Twitter, that they don't exist anymore because they haven't received a Facebook post for sort of 5 days. You might begin to sort of think that you're no longer there. I'm not actually being entirely mocking or ironical, but I think actually you're onto something quite profound, which I hadn't thought enough about, but thank you very much.